The dealer buried the numbers. The Massey Ferguson still won. There is a particular kind of fatigue that settles over a man sitting at a finance desk in a dealership, 3 hours into a negotiation that should have taken 30 minutes. It isn't physical fatigue. It's the kind that comes from trying to hold a dozen numbers in your head at once while someone across the table keeps moving them around just slightly, just enough that you can never quite get a clean look at the whole picture. That was the position Dennis Ackley found himself in on a Thursday afternoon in early February, sitting across from a finance manager named Trent Weibley at a multi-brand dealership called Continental Ag, trying to make sense of a trade-up deal that felt, in his gut, like it was costing him more than it was supposed to without being able to point to exactly where. Dennis was 51 years old, ran just under 1,600 acres of corn and soybeans, roughly 70 miles outside a mid-sized Midwestern city, and had been farming since he was old enough to drive a tractor in a straight line without his father correcting him every 10 minutes. He was not an unsophisticated man. He balanced his own books, understood his operations' margins to the dollar, and had been through enough equipment purchases over 3 decades to know, in general terms, how a fair deal was supposed to feel. This one did not feel fair. It felt complicated in a way that seemed designed to be complicated, and Dennis had learned over the years that complexity in a financial conversation was rarely an accident. The deal on the table involved trading in his current tractor, a competitor brand he'd run for 6 years, toward a newer model from the same manufacturer. Trent had walked him through a trade value, a purchase price, a financing rate, and a monthly payment, presenting each piece of the puzzle separately, in a sequence that made it difficult to step back and see the whole transaction at once. Every time Dennis tried to ask how the pieces fit together, what the actual total cost of the loan would be over its full term, what the real net cost of the trade was once you accounted for the financing terms, Trent would answer the question that was asked, technically accurately, while subtly redirecting the conversation back toward the monthly payment number, which was the one figure in the entire deal that had been engineered to look attractive. This is a pattern that exists across plenty of dealerships, in plenty of industries, not just agricultural equipment, and it isn't always malicious in the sense of being illegal. Much of what happens in a deal like this lives in a gray area between standard sales practice and something closer to deliberate obscuring, where every individual number on the page is technically true, but the way they're sequenced and presented is built to keep a customer focused on the part of the deal that feels good and away from the parts that don't. In Dennis's case, the trade value Trent had offered for his existing tractor was, on its surface, generous, higher than Dennis had expected, which should have been the first signal worth examining more closely rather than less. What Dennis didn't immediately register, because it was buried in a sequence of numbers that moved fast and were presented verbally rather than laid out clearly on paper, was that the inflated trade value had been offset almost exactly by an inflated purchase price on the new machine, a practice common enough in equipment sales that some finance managers refer to it informally, among themselves, as moving money from one pocket to the other. The customer feels like he's getting a strong trade-in number, which generates goodwill and momentum towards signing, while the dealership simply recovers that same value, and often more, on the other side of the transaction, where it's harder to notice. Layered on top of that was a financing term that had been extended from the standard 5 years to 7, which lowered the monthly payment Trent kept returning to in conversation, but which substantially increased the total interest paid over the life of the loan. A longer term on equipment financing isn't inherently predatory. There are legitimate reasons an operator might prefer it, particularly if cash flow timing matters more to that operation than total interest cost. But Trent hadn't framed it as a choice. He'd simply built the longer term into the deal from the start and presented the resulting monthly payment as though it were the natural, inevitable number for a transaction of this size, never mentioning that a shorter term existed as an option, or what the total cost comparison between the two would actually look like. And then there were the fees, documentation fees, a dealer prep charge that ran considerably higher than what Dennis later learned was standard in the region, and an extended service contract that had been added to the deal as what Trent described as already included, when in fact it represented several $1,000s folded quietly into the total financed amount. Dennis sat with the paperwork in front of him that Thursday afternoon, looked at the bottom line monthly payment, and felt the particular discomfort of a man whose instincts are telling him something his eyes can't yet confirm. He didn't sign. He told Trent he wanted to think about it overnight, which Trent received with the kind of practiced patience that salesmen extend to customers they still expect to close. And Dennis drove home with the paperwork in the passenger seat of his truck, turning the numbers over in his head the whole way. That evening, he called a man named Walt Brennan, a farmer 2 counties over, whom Dennis had known for years through the regional equipment auction circuit, and who had, as it happened, been through a remarkably similar experience himself a couple of years earlier, though with a different machine and a different crisis behind it. Walt listened to Dennis describe the deal, asked a few pointed questions about the trade value, the financing term, and the fee structure, and then told Dennis flatly that he'd been through something close to this exact pattern before, at a different dealership, and that the structure Dennis was describing had all the hallmarks of a deal built to obscure rather than to inform. Walt walked him through it the way a friend who's been burned does for someone standing who once stood. He told Dennis to take the paperwork, sit down with a calculator, and work out 2 numbers independently of anything Trent had told him: the actual total amount that would be repaid over the full term of the loan, principal and interest combined, and the true net cost of the new machine once the inflated trade value and the inflated purchase price were stripped out and treated as what they actually were: a single combined number rather than 2 separate ones that happened to cancel out the appearance of a favorable trade. Dennis spent close to 2 hours at his kitchen table that night doing exactly that. Paperwork spread out under the kitchen light, a yellow legal pad beside him, filling up with figures as he worked backward through every number Trent had presented to him that afternoon. What he found, once the obscuring was stripped away, was that the deal as structured would cost him roughly $11,000 more over the life of the loan than an equivalent deal at the standard 5-year term, without the inflated trade-in and purchase price swap, and without the unrequested service contract folded into the principal. $11,000 is not a number most farmers absorb without noticing, once it's made visible to them clearly. The trouble, Dennis understood by the time he set down his pen that night, was that the entire structure of the conversation at Continental Ag had been built specifically to prevent that number from ever becoming visible in the first place. Each piece, presented in isolation, had looked reasonable. It was only in combination, laid out cleanly, rather than delivered verbally in a fast-moving sequence across a finance desk, that the real shape of the deal became clear. He did not go back to Continental Ag the next day to sign. He went, instead, to a Massey Ferguson dealership on the other side of the county, a place called Heartland Ag Equipment, where he'd bought parts before, but had never seriously shopped for a full machine. The salesman who greeted him there, a man named Russ Tilden, who had been in the business more than 2 decades and had built a reputation in that county for a particular kind of straightforward dealing that didn't always maximize short-term commission, but tended to generate the kind of repeat customer loyalty that mattered more over the long run, listened to Dennis describe what he was looking for and what kind of trade he was working with. Dennis, somewhat warily after the previous day's experience, asked Russ directly to walk him through every number separately and in writing before any conversation about a combined monthly payment took place. Russ didn't seem surprised by the request. He told Dennis, in fact, that he wished more customers asked for exactly that, because it made his job easier in the long run, even when it occasionally cost him a faster close. He pulled out a clean sheet and walked through the actual fair market trade value of Dennis's existing tractor, based on current regional auction data and condition, separately and explicitly from the purchase price of the Massey Ferguson 8700S Dennis was now considering. He showed Dennis the standard 5-year financing rate alongside a 7-year alternative, laid the total interest cost of each side by side, and let Dennis choose based on his own cash flow needs rather than steering him toward whichever option produced the smaller, more attractive monthly number. There was no service contract folded silently into the principal. When Dennis asked about an extended warranty, Russ presented it as a separate optional line item with its own clearly stated cost, and gave Dennis an honest assessment of whether he thought it was worth the money given the specific machine's reliability history, which Russ happened to know in some detail because Heartland tracked service records closely across its used and new inventory. The total picture, once Dennis had it laid out cleanly in front of him, showed a deal that was not dramatically cheaper than the original Continental Ag offer in terms of the headline price of the machine itself. Massey Ferguson equipment in that range wasn't notably less expensive than the competitor brand Dennis had been considering. But the absence of the obscured fees, the honest trade valuation, and the transparent financing comparison meant the real total cost of the Heartland deal came in just over $9,000 less than what Dennis had nearly signed for the day before, once every hidden adjustment at Continental Ag was accounted for. Dennis bought the 8700S that week. He didn't rush the decision the way he very nearly had at Continental Ag. Russ gave him the paperwork to take home and review again if he wanted to, which Dennis appreciated as a meaningful contrast to the pressure he'd felt the day before. Though in the end he didn't need much additional time, because the numbers in front of him were already clear enough not to require a second night at the kitchen table. The tractor went to work that spring, and across the 2 seasons that followed, it gave Dennis the kind of unremarkable, dependable performance that doesn't generate dramatic stories on its own. What stuck with Dennis, and what he found himself telling other farmers about more often than he talked about the machine's horsepower or features, was the contrast between the 2 sales experiences themselves. He'd come within one signature of a deal that would have cost him $11,000 more than it needed to, structured in a way specifically designed to keep that number from ever becoming visible to him. And he'd been saved from it not by any particular cleverness on his own part, but by a gut instinct that something didn't add up, a friend who'd been through something similar and knew exactly what to look for, and a couple of hours with a calculator and a legal pad at his own kitchen table. He thought about that contrast often enough that he eventually started bringing it up unprompted when the subject of equipment purchases came up at the co-op, particularly with younger farmers who hadn't yet been through enough deals to have developed the kind of wariness that older operators tend to accumulate over the years. He told them, plainly, that the monthly payment number a finance manager keeps returning to in conversation is very often the number least worth trusting in isolation, precisely because it's the easiest number to manipulate by adjusting the term length, the trade value, and the fee structure around it. He told them to ask every time for the total cost of the loan laid out separately from the monthly payment, and for the trade value and purchase price to be presented as 2 independent numbers rather than a single combined figure that's harder to scrutinize. Walt Brennan, the friend who'd talked him through it that first night, said something to Dennis a while later that stuck with him about how dealerships that rely on obscuring numbers to close a deal are, in a sense, telling you something important about the actual value of what they're selling. If a machine and a financing package were genuinely competitive on their own merits, Walt pointed out, there would be very little reason to bury the real cost structure behind a sequence of individually true but collectively misleading numbers. The obscuring itself, in other words, was a kind of tell, a sign that the deal needed to be hidden from full view in order to look as good as it was being presented to look. Russ Tilden, when Dennis mentioned all this to him sometime later, didn't claim that every Massey Ferguson dealership operated the way Heartland did, and he was careful not to make the story into a simple brand morality tale. He said plenty of dealerships across every brand, including some that sold the same equipment he did, used pricing structures every bit as obscured as what Dennis had encountered at Continental Ag, and that the honest, Transparent approach he tried to take wasn't some universal feature of one manufacturer's dealer network, so much as a personal standard he'd built over 22 years in the business, one he believed paid off in the long run through repeat customers and referrals, even when it occasionally cost him a faster sale in the short run. What had actually saved Dennis, Russ said, wasn't really about which brand's name was on the building. It was about a customer who'd learned, the hard way, to ask for the numbers laid out separately, rather than accepting a monthly payment figure at face value, and who'd found, in this particular instance, a salesman willing to give him exactly that without resistance. Dennis kept the legal pad from that night at his kitchen table for years afterward, tucked into a drawer in his farm office, along with other records he didn't strictly need to keep, but didn't feel right throwing away. He pulled it out once, a couple of years later, when his oldest son started getting serious about taking over more of the operation's equipment decisions, and walked him through the whole sequence of numbers from that February afternoon, line by line, the way Walt had once walked him through it over the phone. He told his son the same thing he eventually told most younger farmers who asked him about it, that an honest deal can survive being broken apart into its individual pieces and examined separately, because every piece holds up to scrutiny on its own. A deal that depends on speed, on sequence, on keeping your attention fixed on one favorable number while several less favorable ones move around behind it, is a deal that's been built specifically to avoid that kind of scrutiny, and that fact alone is usually worth more information than anything the salesman across the desk is actually saying out loud. The tractor itself, by then, had become almost a secondary part of the story in Dennis's telling of it, even though it kept working reliably season after season the way good equipment is supposed to. What he came back to, more often, was the kitchen table, the legal pad, and the moment he'd realized that the $11,000 Continental Ag had nearly cost him wasn't hidden because the people there were uniquely dishonest. It was hidden because that's what the structure of a complicated deal allows, when nobody on the other side of the desk asks the right questions, and when a tired, trusting customer lets a fast-moving conversation carry him past the point where he should have stopped and asked to see the whole picture laid out plainly, one number at a time, with nothing left to move quietly between pockets while his attention was fixed somewhere else. That, in the end, was the part of the story that traveled furthest around the county, further even than the specific dollar figures or the specific machine involved. Not a tale about one brand winning and another losing, but a quieter lesson about what it costs a man to stop asking questions too soon, and what it's worth every time to keep asking them until the numbers stop moving. There was a postscript to the story, one that Dennis didn't tell as often, but that mattered to him privately more than he usually let on. About 18 months after the deal at Heartland, he ran into Trent Whibley at a regional farm equipment show, the kind of large indoor event where dealers from across several counties set up booths and farmers wander the aisles comparing machines before the spring buying season gets underway. Trent recognized him, came over, and made conversation that was friendly enough on the surface, asking how the new tractor was running, mentioning that Continental Ag had some new inventory in that Dennis might want to look at. Dennis was polite, he didn't make a scene, didn't bring up the specifics of the deal he'd walked away from, and didn't accuse Trent of anything directly. But he did ask, almost as an aside, whether Continental Ag still structured their trade-in and purchase price numbers the way they had during his visit, and whether the 7-year financing term was still the default option presented to most customers before any shorter alternative came up. Trent's answer was vague in a way that told Dennis most of what he needed to know. The conversation moved on to other things after that, the way conversations at equipment shows tend to, and the two men parted on cordial enough terms. But Dennis thought about that exchange for a while afterward, turning over the question of how many other farmers in the years since had sat across that same finance desk, watched the same sequence of individually reasonable numbers move past them in conversation, and signed before they'd had the chance to do what he'd done at his kitchen table that February night. He never found out the answer to that question, and he understood there was no real way for him to. What he could control was smaller and more specific, making sure that when the subject came up among people he knew, he told the story plainly enough, and with enough actual numbers attached to it, that at least a few of them might recognize the pattern themselves the next time someone slid a monthly payment figure across a desk and asked them to focus on that number alone. Russ Tilden, for his part, kept doing business the way he always had, machine after machine, season after season, building the kind of dealership reputation that doesn't show up in a single dramatic sale, but accumulates slowly across years of customers who come back, who send their sons and neighbors, who tell the story at the co-op the way Dennis told his. It wasn't a flashy way to run a sales floor. It rarely produced the fastest close or the biggest single-day numbers. But it produced something else, something that mattered more to the kind of operator who farms the same ground for 30 years and expects to be doing business with the same dealer for most of them. The simple, durable value of a deal that means exactly what it says, with nothing moving quietly behind the numbers, while a tired man's attention is fixed somewhere else.